On the cool October night of 1967, a stillness settled over the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, where moss-draped oaks swayed in the darkness, and the old chapel bell of St. Mary's Home for colored children echoed a quiet curfew. Behind its worn brick walls and iron-barred windows, 73 black children, orphans, castaways, and the forgotten, were tucked into their cots, lulled to sleep by the hum of crickets and the distant rhythm of a segregated world. It was a world that rarely looked their way, and when it did, it was seldom with kindness. But that night, 11 of those children, bright, hopeful, resilient souls, would vanish without a trace. No cries were heard, no struggle was reported. At dawn, 11 beds would lie untouched, sheets folded back as if their occupants had simply risen and walked into the night. Among them was Alia Brooks, just 8 years old, with tightly coiled braids and the fierce wisdom of someone twice her age. She had taken it upon herself to help the younger girls with their chores and often stayed up late whispering dreams of becoming a schoolteacher, so no other little black girl ever feels dumb. There were the Jefferson twins, Marcus and Elijah, inseparable boys of 9 who created entire universes with nothing more than pencil stubs and torn notebook paper. There was Naomi James, a quiet bookworm with eyes that never missed a detail and a memory that could recite scripture line by line. And Isaiah Bell, 5 years old and asthmatic, who clung to his nebulizer, and the older brother who always rubbed his back through the night. They were not just names. They were light in a dark time. They laughed in whispers. They fought over who got the last biscuit at dinner. They sang gospel tunes out of tune and drew chalk murals on the back of the dormitory with such joy that even the sternest nun, Sister Ruth, had to smile. Their disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was a silence so unnatural it screamed. At 2 a.m. on October 15th, the night watchman, Aurelius Carter, an aging black man with a limp from a factory injury and a soul long weathered by the Jim Crow South, began his second round of the night. He had worked the orphanage night shift for over 3 years and had never once found a window unlatched or a child out of bed. But that night, as he reached the hallway to the boys' dormitory, something gave him pause. The heavy oak door, usually shut, latched, and secured with a steel pin, was ajar. A shiver ran down his spine. He told himself it must have been the wind, or maybe Sister Joanna had checked on a child and forgotten to close it. Still, something felt off. He stepped in. Moonlight filtered through the dusty curtains, casting long, pale streaks across the rows of beds. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss, but then he began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. He paused. There were 22 beds in the room. 11 were empty. Not just crumpled sheet empty, neat, undisturbed, beds that had clearly not been touched since they were made that morning. Carter's breath caught. He hurried to the girls' dormitory. Aaliyah's bed was also vacant. So were Naomi's and little baby Liza's. He burst into the hallway, heart racing, the echo of his worn boots slapping against the floor as he pounded on the door to Sister Ruth's quarters. "Sister! Sister Ruth, they're gone!" he shouted. The door creaked open moments later, revealing the elderly nun in her nightgown, her silver hair wrapped in a faded scarf. Her eyes, half closed with sleep, blinked with confusion. "What are you saying, Mr. Carter?" "The children," he said, his voice trembling. 11 of them. Their beds, they're empty. I searched the building. They're not here. And the front door, it was locked from the inside, but the key, it was still in the lock." Sister Ruth clutched her cross and staggered back as though the floor had just tilted. In all her years at St. Mary's, she had buried children. She had watched them fade from consumption or break from heartbreak. But never had she lost one, let alone 11, in the middle of the night. The following hours were a blur of frantic searching. Sister Joanna and Sister Abigail combed the attic. Mr. Carter checked the laundry cellar. They scoured the fields behind the home, calling names into the cold air until their voices cracked. But by dawn, nothing had changed. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the dew-covered grass, no clothing, no notes, no broken locks, just silence. At 6:45 a.m., Sister Ruth called the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher on the line sounded half awake. 11 black children missing, he repeated. Ma'am, are you sure they're not playing somewhere on the property? They are gone, Sister Ruth said with fire in her voice. They are gone, and something is very, very wrong. But when the deputies arrived 2 hours later, they were indifferent. They asked a few questions, jotted notes lazily. One of them chuckled and said, "You know how coloured kids like to run off when they're bored." Sister Ruth's hands trembled as she pointed them toward the empty beds. "These are not bad children," she whispered. "These are not children who run." Outside the orphanage, no one noticed that anything was wrong. There were no sirens, no press conferences, no front-page headlines. It was 1967. America was reeling from protests, from riots, from war. 11 missing black children in the South was not the story anyone wanted to hear, not even their own government. But within those red brick walls, among the children who remained and the women who cared for them, grief set in like a storm cloud. Whispers replaced laughter. Doors were double-locked. Little ones slept in clusters for comfort. And the 11 names became prayers repeated at every meal, every mass, every sleepless night. Yet no one knew that the answer, terrible and unimaginable, was already buried in the conscience of the man who had discovered those empty beds. And for the next 27 years he would carry the weight of that night like a chain around his soul until the day he could no longer live with the silence. In the days that followed the disappearance, the halls of St. Mary's grew quieter than ever. The laughter of children that once bounced off the chapel walls had gone hollow. No song, no skipping footsteps, no squabbles over mashed potatoes at lunch. Just silence, the kind of silence that creeps under the skin and anchors itself in the soul. Sister Ruth Calloway barely slept. Her prayers, once filled with gratitude and conviction, had become whispers of desperation, bargaining with a God she was no longer sure was listening. The other nuns, Joanna, Abigail, Therese, moved like shadows through the corridors, eyes red, movements stiff, holding on to their habits as if fabric alone could give them strength. But nothing shook the memory of those empty beds. The authorities did not seem to care. Chatham County deputies returned once more on the third day, not to offer help, but to question the sisters about discipline records. "Were the children unhappy?" one officer asked, chewing the end of his pencil. "Maybe they ran off." 11 children in the middle of the night, without shoes? Sister Joanna replied coldly, "No, these children were not trying to escape. Someone took them." But their voices carried no weight in a town where white lawmen didn't see black children as worth the paperwork. The sheriff's office filed a report, then filed it away. Local newspapers mentioned the case once, buried on page 6, between advertisements for cornmeal and the weather forecast. It read, 11 coloured children missing from orphanage, sheriff investigating possible truancy. That was it. The story was over before it began, but not for Sister Ruth, not for Aurelius Carter, not for the other children left behind. Inside the orphanage, fear morphed into trauma. 10-year-old Gloria, who used to sing hymns at morning mass, refused to speak. Little Raymond wet the bed every night and began sleeping curled in the hallway where light still reached from under the kitchen door. Sister Abigail tried to comfort them, but she too had begun to unravel. She was the one who had brushed Aaliyah's hair that evening, had tied her braids with pink ribbon, had said, "Good night, little bird," before turning out the lights. How do you sleep knowing your little bird never woke up in her own bed again? There were whispers, rumors. Some of the older boys began to say the devil had come and taken the children because they were too good for this world. Others said someone rich must have wanted perfect black children to raise like pets. Sister Ruth dismissed both. She knew evil. She had seen it in the world, in men who spat at her on bus stops, in courtrooms that took children from mothers because of the color of their skin. She didn't believe in superstition, but she did believe this was orchestrated. She just didn't know how deep the roots ran. On the 6th night, Sister Ruth called her old friend Reverend Clarence Boyd, a retired pastor and community leader from Savannah's First Baptist Church. He was 68, sharp as ever, and had once fought to desegregate the school board. When he arrived at St. Mary's and heard the story, he asked only one question. "Has the FBI been contacted?" "No," Sister Ruth replied. "The police told us not to escalate things unnecessarily." "Then they're hiding something," Boyd said flatly. "You don't lose 11 black babies in the middle of the night and tell folks it's nothing." Reverend Boyd wrote letters to the NAACP, to the governor's office, to anyone who might listen. But in 1967, the nation's ear was tuned to louder stations: Vietnam, riots, Dr. King's marches. 11 orphans didn't make headlines, not when they were black, not when they came from nowhere. But behind the scenes, the whispers grew. At the colored barber shop on Whitaker Street, men shook their heads and murmured about government people showing up late at night. At the church basement, some remembered a pale-skinned man in a black car who'd been parked outside St. Mary's for days in late September. Sister Abigail confirmed it. He asked for a tour, said he was from the Department of Education. But when Reverend Boyd contacted the DOE, they denied ever sending anyone to the orphanage. No inspection had been ordered, no program initiated. "What did he look like?" Boyd asked. "Tall," she answered. "Sharp suit, slicked hair, had a clipboard and a briefcase. Spoke like someone who was used to being listened to." And just like that, the pieces began to unnerve Sister Ruth. She remembered that same man standing outside the chapel with a strange smile as the children played in the yard. She remembered him asking about the brightest kids, about their talents, their routines, their ages. At the time, she had seen it as interest. Now it looked like a checklist. "We were being watched," she whispered. "They chose them. They picked our children like fruit off a tree." Meanwhile, Aurelius Carter kept to himself. Though he had not yet spoken a word of his involvement, something inside him had already begun to fracture. He still made his rounds at night, flashlight in hand, boots thudding softly on worn floors. But instead of checking locks, he lingered at the dormitory door. The empty beds haunted him. The night haunted him. And something darker, something he dared not name, gnawed at his conscience. He hadn't told them, not yet, not about the conversation, not about the man who met him weeks before in a smoky bar near Yamacraw, the one who offered him a chance to change those kids' lives, a new facility, better schools, safe housing. All Aurelius had to do was leave the doors unlocked. "They'll be well cared for," the man had said, folding a crisp wad of cash into Aurelius's hand. "We're doing what your state won't." And Aurelius, poor, exhausted, still recovering from his wife's medical bills, had believed him, or at least wanted to. "They're not safe here," the man had whispered. "Do the right thing, Carter." The guilt had eaten him alive ever since. Now, every night, as the wind rattled the old stained-glass windows of St. Mary's, Aurelius sat in the hallway outside the dormitory with his head bowed, listening for footsteps that never came, praying for forgiveness he did not believe he deserved. Because deep down, he had begun to suspect the truth. Those children weren't taken for education, They were taken because someone believed their lives didn't matter. And the world, silent and still, had agreed. By the second week, the names of the missing children began to fade from the lips of the authorities, but at St. Mary's they were recited daily like sacred scripture: Aaliyah, Marcus, Elijah, Naomi, Isaiah, Caleb, Liza, Amari, Zion, Micah, and Hope. 11 names whispered over soup, whispered before bed, whispered like spells to keep their memory alive. Sister Ruth, despite her growing exhaustion, began keeping a journal where she documented everything: what the children were wearing, what they had said the night before they vanished, what songs they had sung during chapel. She called it her Book of Presence, not absence, a refusal to let the world erase children simply because they were poor and black. But outside the orphanage gates, the world moved on. No Amber Alerts, no press bulletins, no reward posters lining the lampposts of Savannah's downtown squares. The mayor's office never visited, the sheriff's department never returned. When Sister Ruth confronted a city councilman after Sunday service, he offered a cold smile and said, "These things have a way of working themselves out." Her hands clenched at her sides. "These things," she repeated. "Those are children, not things." She returned to the orphanage more determined than ever, but also more afraid, because if the system refused to see the children, it certainly would not protect the ones who remained. Fear, like mold, spread through the walls of St. Mary's. Children no longer dared to sleep alone. They clung together in the corners of their dorms, eyes wide in the dark. Some refused to eat, others wet themselves from nightmares. And one afternoon, Sister Joanna found 6-year-old Raymond hiding inside the linen closet, whispering to himself, "They can't take me if I disappear first." Meanwhile, Reverend Boyd continued to write letters, this time to Washington. He sent documents to Congressman John Lewis, to civil rights attorneys, to black newspapers in Harlem and Chicago. He was certain there was a larger story here, one not just about St. Mary's, but about a country where black children were not missing but discarded. Then, on a stormy Thursday evening, he received a call from a woman in Atlanta named Mrs. Loretta Gaines. She was the director of a small, underfunded newspaper called the Black Southern Voice. "I believe your story," she said, "and I believe it's bigger than anyone wants to admit." Within 3 days, Mrs. Gaines arrived at St. Mary's with a tape recorder, a camera, and a notebook worn from use. She interviewed the sisters. She walked the dormitories. She stood outside the locked front door and asked, "Why wasn't it broken?" She took note of how none of the children's personal belongings were missing. So they left with only the clothes on their backs? "If they left at all," Sister Ruth answered, "or were taken?" "And not a single neighbor saw anything?" Mrs. Gaines asked. "Only one woman, Miss Lucille, said she heard an engine idling outside that night. But she didn't look. She was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Mrs. Gaines asked. Sister Ruth hesitated. "Afraid of knowing it was a white man behind the wheel." The implication sank heavy. If the children had been taken by someone white, someone with power, no one in Savannah, especially not a poor black woman in public housing, would have dared to speak. In those days, suspicion could cost you your home, your job, even your life. That evening, Mrs. Gaines sat with Aurelius Carter. He had refused interviews until then, but something about her tone, gentle, persistent, respectful, softened his defenses. "You were here the night they disappeared," she said. "What do you remember?" He looked out the window at the dying sunlight. "I remember the quiet," he said. "Too quiet, like the world had inhaled and never exhaled again." "Did you hear anything? See anyone?" He hesitated. His hands trembled. "I saw shadows, men in suits, a long black car. I didn't move. I didn't stop them." "Why not?" "Because I thought they were rescuing the children, giving them something we couldn't." "Who told you that?" "A man, called himself Mr. Daniels, said he worked for the state, said the kids were special, that they'd be taken to a place where they'd be taught right, where they wouldn't be neglected." "Neglected?" Mrs. Gaines repeated, almost offended. "These children were loved. You know that." Carter nodded slowly. "I do now, I always did. But I wanted to believe. We'd been told for so long we weren't enough, that our care didn't matter, that only they could save us. So I left the door open." And just like that, Mrs. Gaines knew. This wasn't just a story of missing children. It was a story of systemic deceit, of state-sanctioned trafficking dressed as charity, of black caretakers made to doubt their own worth until they handed their children over to strangers in suits. She stood. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Carter. The truth matters. Even now." "It's too late for truth," he said quietly. "They're gone. but not forgotten. Before leaving, Mrs. Gaines walked back to the chapel. She sat in the back pew and wept, not just for the children, but for what had allowed it to happen, for every locked file, for every silent witness, for every government seal hiding stolen names. That night, she filed the first draft of her article. Its headline would read, "The Ones No One Looked For." She mailed it to every black paper she could. She mailed it to Washington. And she made a vow to Sister Ruth, to Reverend Boyd, and to the ghosts now haunting St. Mary's, that this story would not die like the children had. Not in silence. Not again. 2 weeks after the article by the Black Southern Voice quietly rippled through the underground black press, the mainstream still hadn't blinked. No retractions from city officials, no grand jury, no federal agents at the orphanage gates. But something had shifted. Inside the walls of St. Mary's, the children noticed that Sister Ruth held her head a little higher. Reverend Boyd spent more time at the orphanage now, checking locks himself, reading psalms to the children at night. And Mrs. Gaines continued her quiet war with silence, knocking on doors others feared to touch. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was addressed to the orphanage. No return address, just shaky handwriting in blue ink. Inside was a photograph, black and white, folded neatly. 11 children stood outside a wooden house, eyes wide, stiff postures, some barefoot. It was dated October 17th, 1967, 2 days after the children disappeared. Sister Ruth pressed it to her chest like a holy relic. They were alive, she whispered. 2 days later, still alive. Mrs. Gaines, now considered more detective than journalist, scanned the background. A house, rural, fenced with old timber. There was a sign partially cut off in the corner. Only the letters "Chur" were visible. Church? She spent the next 4 days driving the Georgia backroads, passing through ghost towns and broken-down churches until she reached a forgotten corner near Hawkinsville. A local farmer, when shown the photo, said he recognized the place. "That's New Light Mission," he mumbled. "Shut down back in '68. Some say it was never a real church to begin with." Mrs. Gaines found it the next morning. The building was sunken into itself, overtaken by kudzu and vines, windows boarded, steeple cracked. But the front steps were the same as in the photo. She stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was sour. Mildew, dust, time. A few wooden pews remained, some broken, others smeared with chalk drawings. In a back room, where sunlight barely reached, she found a rusted filing cabinet. Empty, except for one envelope. Inside were 4 Polaroids, all dated late October 1967. The children again, but this time not all of them, only 8. And their expressions had changed. Aaliyah, once full of defiant light, now looked numb. Marcus and Elijah were holding hands, both staring straight into the camera with flat eyes. One photo showed a man standing behind them. He wore a dark suit, a tie pin in the shape of an eagle. His face was blurry, but there was something unforgettable about the angle of his jaw, the confidence of his stance. Mrs. Gaines had seen that stance before, in descriptions from Sister Abigail. It had to be him, the man who called himself Mr. Daniels. She returned to Savannah with the photos and immediately contacted Reverend Boyd. Together they brought the evidence to Atlanta's office of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There, a young legal assistant named Wallace King reviewed the material. "This is enough to open a federal complaint," he said, "especially with multiple minors crossing state lines." "They never crossed them legally," Mrs. Gaines said bitterly. "They were trafficked." "Then we start there." Within days, Boyd, Gaines, and King began compiling a dossier. Eyewitness accounts, missing records, financial ledgers, and the list of 11 names. The case was passed to a newly formed civil rights task force, barely funded, barely recognized, but it was something, and it finally got someone's attention. Aurelius Carter. Late one night, after the children had been put to bed and the sisters had retreated to their quarters, Carter approached Sister Ruth in the chapel. His eyes were sunken deeper than ever. "I lied," he said. "I told that reporter I didn't see their faces, but I did." Sister Ruth said nothing. She waited. There were 3 men, not just one, all white. The man in the middle did all the talking. Daniels. The others moved like soldiers, silent, strong. They wore gloves. "What did they do, Aurelius?" she asked gently. "They came in through the back hall. I unlocked it just before 2. They knew exactly where to go. No noise, no light, like they had practiced. I didn't think I'd have to watch." He swallowed hard. "But I saw them lead the children down the back stairwell. They didn't cry, not one. It was like they'd been coached." "Coached how?" "Daniels came to St. Mary's earlier that week. Said he was evaluating children for special placement. I didn't know he talked to the kids until later. Told them they'd get to ride in a car, that they'd see new schools, that they wouldn't be treated like charity cases anymore, that they'd belong to families who'd really love them." His voice cracked. "And I believed him." Sister Ruth's voice trembled. "Why didn't you say this before?" "Because I took the money, because I told myself they'd be okay, because I was tired of being poor and tired and invisible and—" He stopped. "Because I didn't believe anyone would care what happened to a bunch of colored children." Sister Ruth closed her eyes. "We care, we've always cared, and now others will too." The next morning, with Carter's full confession, Mrs. Gaines and Wallace King held a private press conference at a black community center. They unveiled the photos, read the names, played recordings of Aurelius's voice. That afternoon, for the first time in nearly a month, a national black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, published the story on its front page: "The Children Who Vanished, a Silence That Was Bought." More would follow. That same week, a retired government clerk, once employed by Georgia's Department of Human Welfare, came forward. He admitted that in late 1967 there were internal orders to destroy a series of reports involving unauthorized child transfers. One of the men behind it had political ambitions, the clerk said these kids were better off placed where they could be molded right. "And who approved those orders?" King asked. "I don't know all the names, but I do remember this," the clerk said. "The man with the briefcase, it wasn't just a recruiter, he was connected, real connected." When asked if he remembered what the man looked like, the clerk replied, "He had one of those faces that smiles without smiling, like the grin was written into the bone." And just like that, the search for Mr. Daniels wasn't just about finding a man, it was about unraveling a system that had hidden him. One photo, one confession, one house in the woods. The truth was cracking open, but what lay underneath would shake the country. Because what had started as the story of 11 missing black children was fast becoming something far more terrifying, proof that the people entrusted to protect them had sold them instead. The deeper they dug, the colder the truth became. For decades, St. Mary's had stood as a symbol of safety for black orphans in Georgia, a modest, overburdened refuge in a world that often refused to see them. But now, through torn records and brittle testimonies, it was becoming clear that even sanctuaries could be compromised, especially when the predators came dressed in authority. Mrs. Gaines returned to Atlanta with the evidence gathered so far: photographs, testimonies, Aurelius Carter's confession, and a partial list of names taken from the orphanage's 1967 intake ledger. She had one goal now: find out where the children went. The Federal Civil Rights Task Force, barely holding funding, reached out to Interpol, the FBI, and multiple adoption agencies, only to hit walls. Too many names had been changed, too many documents lost or falsified. One after another, adoption files from 1967-68 across several states showed signs of tampering: missing birth dates, no biological parent information, rapid processing times. But the most damning clue came from a customs report. Wallace King, the civil rights attorney now overseeing the legal push, managed to access archived federal shipping manifests from the port of Charleston. Tucked in a list from November 1967 was a curious entry: medical transfer, 11 minors, Classified, private sponsor, destination, Montreal. No further detail, no names, just a bureaucratic ghost trail. But the date aligned exactly, 3 weeks after the St. Mary's children vanished. Mrs. Gaines and King began following the Montreal lead. A contact at the Canadian Border Service confirmed that during the late 1960s, several private child wellness programs had been registered to religious non-profits. One of them, the Haven Trust, had since dissolved, but not before placing dozens of children in affluent households throughout the US and Europe. These adoptions were often unofficial, sometimes facilitated by philanthropic intermediaries that bypassed local authorities entirely. In a photograph from the Haven Trust's 1967 annual report, filed in the Canadian National Archives, Mrs. Gaines spotted something that made her knees go weak. Aaliyah Brooks. Her braids were undone, her eyes hollowed by confusion, but it was her. Standing behind her were Marcus and Elijah Jefferson, dressed in unfamiliar suits, gazing blankly into the distance. They were not smiling, they were not home. Meanwhile, in Savannah, the climate was changing. The national attention brought protesters, journalists, and attorneys to the steps of City Hall. Civil rights leaders called for congressional hearings. The mayor, under growing pressure, tried to deflect blame, stating the orphanage was run independently and that no official ties existed between the city and any transfer programs. But the records told a different story. Mrs. Gaines uncovered internal memos from 1966 and 1967 showing that state officials had met with private development agents about a plan to optimize welfare burdens through faith-based relocation. The language was coded, but the implications were brutal. Black children, especially those orphaned or undocumented, were viewed as administrative weight. Move them, erase them, repackage them. But as new truths surfaced, so did deeper wounds. At St. Mary's, Sister Abigail began receiving anonymous phone calls at night. The voice was male, calm, cold. "You've said enough," he whispered once. "The more you dig, the less you'll like what you find." On another night, "Tell your journalist to be careful, roads are dark out there." The sisters increased security. Reverend Boyd insisted they install floodlights, hired a local deacon to stand watch overnight. But fear had returned, coiling like smoke through the building. Then one morning, Aurelius Carter collapsed. He had kept a journal, much like Sister Ruth's, but his was filled with unfinished sentences, questions he asked himself again and again. What if I had said no? What did they do to Isaiah? Does God forgive men who watched it happen? He was rushed to the hospital, barely conscious. Terminal cancer, the doctors confirmed. Days left, maybe a week. On his final night, Sister Ruth sat beside him. "They were your children too, you know," she said softly. "They trusted you."
"I know," he croaked, "and I let them walk out that door." "There's still time to speak," she whispered. "Speak the last truth."
Aurelius stared at the ceiling. "There was more that night," he rasped. "When the men left the dorm, one of them, he wasn't carrying a child, he was carrying something wrapped in a blanket. Small. Still." Sister Ruth stiffened. "You think—"
"I don't know," he said, tears seeping from the corners of his eyes. "But I never saw Isaiah again, and he was the smallest, the sickliest. Maybe he didn't make it."
Sister Ruth felt her throat close. For all the horrors they had uncovered, nothing hit harder than the idea that at least one of those children never even made it past the first stop. Aurelius died that night, the weight of 27 years finally lifting in one last breath. The next day, at the orphanage chapel, Sister Ruth gathered the remaining children and read his name aloud during morning prayer. Not as a monster, not as a martyr, but as a man who had failed and then finally tried to make it right. Elsewhere, the investigation broke new ground. Inquiries into former state employees, now retired or relocated, revealed that Mr. Daniels was likely an alias used by Robert Eastman, once a government contract administrator with ties to the Haven Trust. Eastman had left the US in 1970. Rumors placed him in Switzerland. Others claimed he died in an accidental fire in New Jersey in 1983. No definitive trace, But it no longer mattered. The system he helped build had already been exposed. By the end of 1994, congressional hearings had begun. Mrs. Gaines testified. Sister Ruth submitted written statements, and for the first time in American legal history, a case was opened under the designation Trafficking of Minor Black Children under False Institutional Authority, 1967-1970. The story, once whispered among those who feared too much to speak, was now being read aloud in the chambers of justice. And yet, 9 children still remained unaccounted for. Where were they? Were they alive? Had they been raised believing they were orphans from birth? Had they forgotten their own names? Or worse, had the world made them forget on purpose? The answers lay ahead, but for now, the silence had been broken. In early January 1995, nearly 3 months after Aurelius Carter's final breath and the first congressional hearing, a tremor ran through the quiet suburbs of Chicago when Robert Johnson, a 37-year-old accountant and father of 2, received an envelope from the Department of Justice marked Confidential. Personal Identity Inquiry. Inside was a letter with an attached photograph. A photograph of a little black boy sitting next to a girl with thick braids and a protective arm around his shoulder, a photograph taken in 1967 in Savannah, Georgia, at a place called St. Mary's Home for Colored Children. Beneath the image was a caption, "Do you recognize yourself or anyone in this photo?" Robert stared at it for a long time. Something in his chest began to stir. The boy's eyes, his own eyes, wide, uncertain, hopeful, looked back at him from another lifetime. He was that child, and yet he remembered none of it clearly, only fragments, smells of pine floors, songs sung off key, and a soft voice whispering "Don't let go" as they walked somewhere in the dark. For 37 years he had believed he was born in Michigan, orphaned by a car crash, adopted by a kind white couple who raised him with stability and love. Now he was being told he had a brother, a name he had lost, and a history that had been stolen from him. Within days he was on a plane to Georgia, shaking, sweating, and full of questions. He landed in Savannah and was taken directly to the orphanage, now renovated, repainted, and still bearing its crucifix like a burden. Inside, Sister Ruth waited, holding a folder filled with records, photographs, and the answers he didn't know how to ask for. The moment he walked through the doors, something hit him. Not memory, but gravity, like the walls themselves remembered him, even if he could not remember them. She led him to a small chapel room where a man was already waiting, tall, nervous, with fingers clasped tightly together. As soon as Robert stepped inside, the man looked up, and his hands dropped. "Marcus," Robert whispered, though he had never said that name before in his adult life, and yet it felt like air being released after decades of holding his breath. "Elijah," Marcus said back, eyes glassy. "My name's Elijah now, but you—" Robert stepped forward, then stopped, then stepped again, and the 2 men stood eye to eye, strangers wrapped in the same skin, split halves of a childhood neither one could fully remember, but both could feel. They embraced without needing words. Their shoulders trembled, breaths uneven. Sister Ruth stepped back, wiping a tear, as 2 brothers reunited not through nostalgia, but through the ache of something nearly lost forever. Over the next hours they shared the pieces they had. Elijah had never been adopted. Instead, he was left behind during the second transfer in 1967, taken in by a local black teacher who had suspected something was wrong. When government men dropped a child off with no papers, no name, and a sealed envelope of cash, the teacher never told Elijah the truth. Fearing that knowing might only hurt him more, Elijah had grown up poor, had struggled, had ended up teaching high school himself, trying to give to others what he never received, and now, face to face with a brother he thought only existed in dreams, he felt rage and gratitude and sorrow all clashing at once. Robert's life had been stable, but built on lies. Elijah's had been hard, but at least real. Both felt robbed, yet neither blamed the other. They had both been victims. The question now was, how many more were out there? And what had happened to the ones not as lucky as them? Soon, word arrived from Paris. A woman named Sophia Anderson had contacted the DOJ after reading an online article about the saint. Mary's case: she had grown up in Lyon, adopted at the age of 6 by a French academic couple, always knowing she wasn't born there but never knowing where she had come from. She had memories: songs in English, the smell of collard greens, a thin girl with honey-coloured skin who once told her, "We're going somewhere better." Her memories had been dismissed as childhood fantasy, but when she saw the photo in the article, she recognized herself, and Aliyah, and Zion. She remembered the house in the woods, the instructions to smile, the warnings not to talk. She also remembered when Aliyah stopped coming to meals, and how everyone started whispering after that. "They said she didn't make it," Sophia said in her letter, "but no one ever told us why." Now she was willing to testify, to reclaim her past, to help find the others. By the spring of 1995, 5 of the 11 missing children had been identified. 3 had been located overseas, each living under a different name, each with a carefully constructed past provided by intermediaries that no longer existed. Every reunion was emotional but also incomplete. There were no parents to return to, no homes to reclaim, only shadows of what might have been. And still, there were 6 unaccounted for, and the 2 believed to be dead, the evidence mounted in layers, a network of shell organizations, false faith-based trusts, fake social service licenses, all traced back to men like Robert Eastman, formerly Mr. Daniels, whose death in a fire was now under suspicion. It was becoming clearer that the operation was more than opportunistic trafficking. It was targeted, designed to erase black children who showed brilliance or potential and place them elsewhere, retrained, renamed, repurposed, for reasons that remained unspeakably sinister. Whether for adoption, experimentation, or something more twisted, no one could yet prove. But what was certain now was that these children had not been taken by random monsters, but by a system cloaked in benevolence and bureaucracy. By May, under pressure from civil rights groups and national attention, a congressional subcommittee was formed, titled "The Legacy of St. Mary's: Racialized Child Displacement in 20th Century America," and as hearings began in Washington, Sister Ruth was asked to testify. She stood in front of senators, some sympathetic, others skeptical, and said, "You want to know how this happened? Because the world didn't see them as children. It saw them as excess, as invisible. And when black children go missing, no one blinks unless they burn down a building with them inside." Her voice did not waver, her words etched into the official record, and somewhere behind her, Robert and Elijah sat side by side, their presence a living contradiction to the lie that those children had simply disappeared. They hadn't, they had been taken, and now, finally, some of them were coming back. Not as the children they were, but as the witnesses the world could no longer ignore. As summer rippled through Georgia, a searing heat wave gripped the state, but inside the archives of a long-defunct courier service in Macon, a climate-controlled vault offered more than cool air. It held forgotten ledgers, sealed envelopes, and one small metal box that would crack the entire case wide open. The discovery happened by accident when a volunteer historian named Terence Reed, cataloguing materials for a civil rights museum, noticed a faded package labeled "St. Mary's Confidential, November 1967. Inside the package were receipts, transit authorizations, and a single envelope stamped "Do Not Deliver." Curiosity overtook caution. Terence opened it and unfolded a letter penned in hurried cursive. The ink had bled slightly, but the content was disturbingly clear. It was addressed to Mr. Eastman and signed only B. The letter outlined concerns that the Montreal transfer included a child not on the approved manifest. It stated that Aliyah is showing signs of resistance and must be removed from the second phase of placement, and then, with gut-churning finality, a line that read, "Recommend termination in transport, disposal in Route 95 site." Terence stood frozen, the document trembling in his hands. Termination, disposal, the words echoed like a scream in a locked room. He immediately contacted the DOJ task force, and within hours, Mrs. Gaines, Sister Ruth, and the federal investigators were converging in Macon to verify the document's authenticity. Handwriting analysis, ink dating, and archival cross-referencing confirmed its legitimacy. The letter was real. It had never been mailed, and it implicated not just Eastman, but at least one other operative, codenamed B, working under the same system. But it also offered a new lead, Route 95 site, a reference that launched a multi-agency search up and down Interstate 95, focusing on abandoned warehouses, drainage tunnels, and forgotten rest stops that had existed in 1967. Using GIS mapping and historical transportation logs, they narrowed it down to 3 potential locations within a 40-mile radius of Savannah, all linked by trucking routes that connected the orphanage to the port of Charleston. The first 2 sites yielded nothing. The third, an old overgrown way station near Darien, looked like nothing more than a crumbling ruin overtaken by vines and rot. But ground-penetrating radar told a different story. Under the dirt and debris, investigators found remnants of a locked steel crate buried under 2 feet of soil. When unearthed, it took hours to pry it open. The air that escaped was foul, ancient, and heavy. Inside were fragments of fabric, buttons from a child's coat, and a rusted bracelet engraved with the initials AB. Nearby, buried separately, were tiny bones, fragile, incomplete, but unmistakably human. Forensic analysis would later confirm what Sister Ruth already knew in her heart. They had found Aaliyah Brooks, and she had never made it past Georgia. The news shattered what little hope remained for some and ignited fury in others. Vigils were held in Savannah, Atlanta, and Washington, candles lit in silent rows, photos of Aaliyah printed on placards that read, "She was only 7. Elijah and Robert stood at one of the vigils, arms locked, eyes glassy, knowing their sister had died not from accident, but from intent. Her resistance had cost her everything, and now, finally, someone would answer for it. Within weeks, the DOJ released a list of new targets, former state contractors and religious intermediaries who had vanished from public view but were now being pulled back into the light. One of them, a man named Bernard Lawton, retired, and living under an alias in Oregon, was identified as the likely B in the letter. He had once served as Adoption Logistics Coordinator for the Haven Trust, and after years of hiding was arrested on federal charges of conspiracy, child trafficking, and manslaughter. His trial was set for early 1996, but the pressure was already building. As former saint, Mary's children began coming forward, no longer ashamed or afraid. Some had pieced together their identities from old memories, others had only recently been contacted, and one, a woman named Laverne, now living in Birmingham, had never even known she was adopted, until a DNA test her daughter took for fun revealed anomalies that led her back to Georgia, back to the orphanage, and back to a name she'd never heard before, but somehow recognized in her bones. Naomi Brown. She had been 3 when she was taken, and now, 31, she stood outside the courthouse steps where Bernard Lawton would soon be tried, and said to reporters, "They tried to erase us, but we're still here, and we remember everything, even when we don't." Meanwhile, Sister Ruth, frail but still fire-hearted, gave one final interview before her health began to decline. She said, "I thought no one would care about black children in the 60s, and they were right for a while, but now the world has changed, and our voices are loud enough to shake the graves they buried the truth in." She passed away quietly in her sleep the following month. Her obituary read, simply, "Servant of the Forgotten, Keeper of the Light." She was buried near St. Mary's, beside a newly installed memorial for the 11 children lost in 1967. Etched in stone were all their names, those who had been found, those still missing, and in the center, Aaliyah Brooks under a phrase carved in gold. They were not invisible. We see them now, but even as justice approached for some, mystery still surrounded the final 3 children. No records, no witnesses, no names had emerged. Mrs. Gaines believed they had been placed abroad, possibly in households under new identities, so well crafted they'd never think to question them. The investigation expanded to the UK, Germany, and Brazil, where the Haven Trust had operated shell charities for over a decade, but for now they had found 6 survivors, identified 2 deceased, and built the beginnings of a national reckoning. But for every headline, for every courtroom hearing, there was a deeper, darker truth still looming. What had truly motivated the removals? Was it merely racism and profit? Or was there a deeper, more coordinated agenda buried beneath the bureaucratic layers as autumn neared and the Lawton trial drew closer? One thing became clear: the St. Mary's case was not an isolated wound. It was a symptom of something systemic, something still breathing under the surface, waiting to be named. The turning point came not with another discovery, but with a voice that had been silent for decades and now emerged through a secure phone call routed through 3 international proxies before landing in the inbox of the DOJ's Special Task Force. The message was simple, typed in cold precision. I was there. I kept records. Meet me. Do not involve the press. The email signature was a pseudonym, Icarus 7. At first, the team thought it was a hoax, a crank exploiting the headlines for attention. But when the anonymous sender attached a photograph, an internal memo dated July 12, 1967, marked with Eastman's signature and the stamp of the Haven Trust, including a list of 7 initials corresponding to the known missing children, everything changed. Cross-referencing confirmed the authenticity. Someone from inside the operation had kept records. Someone had survived long enough to feel the weight of conscience. Under heavy security and surveillance, a meeting was arranged in a safe house near Richmond, Virginia. The man who walked in wore a grey wool cap, sunglasses, and carried a briefcase wrapped in 2 layers of duct tape. He introduced himself as Everett Kane. He had once been a junior case manager for the Haven Trust's International Youth Placement Program. In 1967, he was 28, idealistic, and unaware of the darkness that swirled beneath the surface of what he thought was a global adoption charity. But by the time he realized what the program really was, an orchestrated network to displace, erase, and repurpose black children, he was already complicit. He had arranged transfers, signed forms, escorted children from holding rooms to vans. It had taken him nearly 3 decades to admit that silence made him guilty. Kane placed on the table a cache of microfilm reels, 7 journals, and over 200 pages of coded logs. It was the holy grail of evidence: names, locations, donor lists, handler identities, international routing numbers, flight manifests, and even psychological evaluations marked with sinister classifications like asset viability, low, and compliance score, pending adjustment. The team froze. These weren't just adoptions, they were behavioral experiments, conditioning, reassignments, projects masked under religious cover. And the most horrifying part, some of the funding came from private contracts linked to pharmaceutical research groups, defense psychological units, and one university department Kane refused to name but called the Mind Room. "We were told," Kane said, voice breaking, "that these kids had no families, that they were wards, that we were saving them, but they weren't wards, they were targets, selected because they were brilliant or defiant, or simply unwanted by a country that feared too many black children with too much potential." He stopped speaking. Tears rolled down his face. The silence was deafening. Within hours, the DOJ filed emergency warrants. The microfilm reels revealed a chilling connection. St. Mary's was only one of 5 orphanages used for these purposes between 1959 and 1972, and the program's codename had been Washout. Its stated mission in a top-level file, reintegration of volatile subjects into compliant global social frameworks. The implication was staggering. These children hadn't just been taken, they'd been erased, rewritten, made into something else. In a DC press conference 3 days later, Attorney General Denise Palmer publicly confirmed the existence of Washout, stating, "This was not merely a child trafficking ring, it was a systemic violation of civil and human rights at the federal level. The victims were American citizens, black children, some were lost, some were found, and some were reprogrammed." The news rocked the nation. Protests erupted in major cities, Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, New York, led by survivors and advocacy groups demanding not just justice, but truth. Reparations became part of the public discourse. Civil rights veterans joined with newer grassroots movements. Congress was forced to open a formal investigative committee called the Commission for Stolen Lives, headed by Representative Clara Jennings, herself a former social worker who had long suspected foster care disparities were tied to something deeper. Meanwhile, back in Savannah, Elijah and Robert, alongside the surviving children now grown, launched a foundation named after their lost sister, the Aliyah Initiative. Its mission was to identify displaced children of color across historical systems, provide legal assistance, and archive the stories erased by time and policy. At its opening ceremony, a surprise occurred. A woman named Melinda Graham, a quiet janitor from rural Alabama, stepped to the podium holding a letter. It had been mailed to her mother in 1969 but never opened until she passed away in 1998. Inside was a photograph, 3 children in the woods holding hands, and a note that said, "One day, tell them I tried." The handwriting matched Zion's. Zion, the 11th child, the one no one had found. Now there was proof he had survived. His name had never appeared in adoption registries. His initials were missing from the Kane files. It meant only one thing: Zion had escaped the program, and for nearly 3 decades he had been on the run. As Part 8 closed, the narrative shifted from uncovering the past to chasing the last living ghost of St. Mary's, the boy who had outwitted the entire machine, the one they called Zion, who might hold the last piece of the puzzle. And somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the South, a man who went by no name anymore read the headlines and knew it was time to come home. In a small, wind-scraped town on the outskirts of Natchez, Mississippi, a man who called himself Solomon lived in an old cabin with no mailbox, no electricity, and only a hand-pumped well for water. His neighbors thought of him as a recluse, quiet, respectful, good with his hands. He helped fix broken shutters, patched roofs before storms, and traded wood carvings at the Sunday market. But what they didn't know was that he never once showed his face to a camera, never signed a contract, and never stayed anywhere longer than 5 years. For decades, Solomon had survived by disappearing again and again, until one day at the market, a girl selling bracelets offered him a photo. It was a laminated flyer from the Aliyah Initiative, bearing the faces of the 11 missing children from 1967. His eyes landed on his own, age 8, smiling with 2 front teeth missing. The name under it said Zion Ellis. His hands trembled. He thanked the girl, slipped the flyer into his jacket, and vanished before anyone noticed. That night, he packed only what he needed: 2 notebooks, a compass, and the worn bracelet that once belonged to Aliyah, and left the cabin behind. He didn't know who to trust, but he knew one thing: it was time to speak. 2 days later, Robert Gaines received a handwritten note in the P.O. box tied to the foundation. It read, "I was there, I remember everything, she saved me, she paid the price, tell Ruth I kept her promise. Z." Enclosed was a photo, aged, stained, but unmistakable. Zion and Aliyah crouched behind the orphanage's north shed, grinning beneath a makeshift blanket fort. Robert froze. Zion wasn't just alive, he was reaching out. Working with federal marshals and DOJ agents, they traced the letter through postmarks, handwriting, and even the paper stock. Within 48 hours, they located the last post office it had passed through, Vidalia, Louisiana, a small, sleepy town across the river from Natchez. It was close, almost too close. Agents canvassed markets, motels, roadside diners. And then, in the guest log of a church shelter, under the name Ellis Z., they found him. Zion was arrested not with force, but with care. He walked out calmly, clutching a worn duffel bag, and said only one thing: "Don't put me under lights, I'll tell you everything, but not under lights." He was taken to a private facility where trauma-sensitive protocols were followed. He spoke slowly at first, then faster, then without stopping. What he described shook even the most seasoned agents. After Aliyah was separated from the others in late 1967, Zion overheard a conversation between Eastman and a nurse named Lisette. "Termination in transit," she said. "The girl's a problem." That night, Zion snuck out, using a loose vent he'd watched an older boy pry open weeks before. He found the maintenance tunnels, crawled for what felt like hours, and surfaced half a mile from the main building. He had no plan, only fear and the need to survive. Over the next 3 years, Zion moved across the South, hiding in train yards, stealing food from back porches, avoiding anyone in uniform. He lived in churches, under bridges, in the crawl spaces of abandoned homes. Once, in Jackson, he was caught stealing fruit and was nearly turned over to a state shelter, until an elderly black woman named Miss Alberta hid him in her root cellar for 5 weeks. She never asked who he was, just said, "The world lost too many of our babies already. You won't be one of them." Zion cried that night. For Aliyah, for Sister Ruth, for the boy he no longer recognized. In 1972, he took the name Solomon from a Bible Miss Alberta gave him. He had been Solomon ever since. "I never stopped running," he told the agents, "because I thought if I stopped they'd erase me too." The DOJ offered him protective custody. He refused. "I want to testify," he said. "I want them to see my face, the one they tried to erase." The news broke nationally within a day. Zion Ellis, found after 28 years, survived St. Mary's disappearance. Survivors wept, reporters begged for interviews, protesters marched holding signs that said, "You can't erase us." But Zion stayed hidden until the day of the trial. When Bernard Lawton was brought into federal court, flanked by lawyers and federal guards, the room went silent as the prosecution called their final witness. A man walked to the stand, grey beard, steady hands, and eyes like flint. "State your name," the attorney asked. "Zion Ellis," he said. "Born April 5, 1959, St. Mary's Orphanage, Savannah, Georgia." Gasps filled the room. Lawton turned pale, and Zion began. "In 1967, they told us we were going to new homes, but that was a lie. They didn't want to save us. They wanted to study us, erase us, use us. But I remember. I remember everything." For 4 hours, he testified, about the trucks, the white coats, the sedation, the punishments for disobedience, the moments before Aliyah was taken, and the last time he ever saw her, clutching a drawing she'd made of the 3 of them, Aliyah, Robert, and Zion, under a tree. "They told her she didn't belong," he said. "But she was the only one who ever made me feel like I did." When he finished, the court was silent. Lawton wept. Not from remorse, but from knowing the mask was gone. Zion's testimony made front-page news across the country, but more importantly, it opened the floodgates. 10 more survivors came forward within a week, and 5 sealed files were unlocked by court order. The truth was spreading, and there was no stopping it now. But even as the courtroom echoed with justice, Zion's words whispered something deeper. They wanted to erase us. But every scar is a story. And I'm still writing mine. The courtroom had never felt so cold. Cameras weren't allowed, but the sketch artists' pens trembled as they captured the moment the jury delivered their verdicts, guilty on 12 counts of conspiracy, kidnapping, unlawful human experimentation, and obstruction of justice. Bernard Lawton, former executive director of the Haven Trust, sat expressionless, his fingers pressed together as if in prayer, but no God had arrived for him. As the gavel fell, Judge Loretta Graves spoke firmly. "For crimes against children, against humanity, and against the spirit of justice, this court finds you utterly responsible." The gallery erupted, not in applause, but in muffled sobs, embraces, and the quiet release of decades of held breath. Zion sat at the back, untouched by the chaos, staring at a folded paper in his palm. The drawing Aliyah made before she was taken. The tree. The 3 of them. A memory preserved in crayon. But justice in court was only the beginning. Outside the building, protesters held signs reading, "Where are the others?" and "Justice for the Forgotten." The Department of Justice had promised a full excavation of Haven Trust's records and its affiliate programs, and now, armed with Zion's testimony and Kane's documentation, the dominoes began to fall. Within weeks, 2 retired doctors in San Diego were arrested. In Atlanta, a warehouse owned by a now-defunct pharmaceutical firm was searched, and what they found inside stunned even seasoned agents. Thousands of vials labeled with serial numbers matching those from Washout's logs, plus psychological profiles of children, many marked with the horrifying tag, deceased, non-viable. Even more chilling was the discovery of internal communication between Haven Trust and a military contractor working on psychological conditioning. The files confirmed what Zion had feared all along. Some of the children weren't adopted or killed. They had been reassigned. Some ended up in institutions, others in obscure research facilities. A few were even sent overseas. They were not just lost. They had been erased, documents falsified, memories wiped, with experimental drug protocols, new names given, and files sealed under national security clearances. In a press conference watched by millions, Attorney General Denise Palmer faced the nation. "We are no longer dealing with one orphanage or one rogue program," she said, her voice steady. "We are confronting a systemic, decades-long operation that viewed black children as disposable, malleable, and useful only as data points or currency. We owe the victims truth. We owe them names. We owe them their stories back." Meanwhile, Robert Gaines and Elijah Brooks traveled to cities across the country, searching for traces of the other children. In St. Louis, they met a woman named Kyra, who'd always wondered why her adoption file had entire pages redacted. She remembered injections, white walls, and a little girl named Leah who used to hum before bed. In a trembling voice, she whispered, "I think I knew Aaliyah." In New Orleans, they found Darnell, a retired truck driver who had fragments of memory, a nun with kind eyes, a boy who wouldn't talk, and a metal tag he used to wear around his neck that read Subject 36. He had no idea why he was afraid of cribs or cold rooms. When shown a picture of St. Mary's, he dropped the photo. "That place," he said, "I see it in my nightmares." The deeper they dug, the more it became clear. This was not simply about the 11, it was about hundreds, possibly thousands, and the weight of that truth made the victory in court feel like only the opening chapter in a much darker book. But there were bright spots too. Survivors began organizing. The Aaliyah Initiative opened a center for memory recovery, staffed by psychologists and cultural historians. A mural of the 11 children was unveiled in Savannah, painted on the wall of a former government building that once held sealed washout files. Zion attended the ceremony, but said nothing. He simply placed Aaliyah's bracelet in the center of the painted tree and walked away. Still, the most startling revelation was yet to come. A reporter named Kenya Hastings from the Baltimore Herald uncovered a set of diplomatic cables from 1970 marked urgent. The memos described a failed attempt to transfer 6 children from a U.S. facility to a research hospital in Switzerland. The plane had crashed in Newfoundland, killing all on board. The names of the children were never released, but the numbers matched sealed Haven records. 3 of those children were part of the St. Mary's group. That explained some disappearances, but not all. Zion, after weeks of solitude, finally sat for an interview, only audio, his condition for anonymity. His voice was soft but resolved. "There are places I still can't go in my mind, rooms I locked when I was 9, but I remember this. We were made to feel like shadows, and now we're stepping into the light. I may never know where Aaliyah ended up. I may never know if she made it. But I know this. She saved me, and now I'm saving her story." When asked what justice meant to him, Zion paused and said, "Justice isn't prison. Justice is a name remembered. Justice is a child no longer called missing. Justice is not being afraid to sleep." Back in Savannah, Sister Ruth, now in a hospice facility, was told of the verdict. She held the hand of a nurse, closed her eyes, and said, "They called them lost, but I never stopped praying they'd be found." As she drifted to sleep, a letter rested on her bedside, a copy of the drawing Aaliyah once made. It was signed by Zion. The nation was finally listening. But in the silence that followed, everyone knew the question was no longer what happened to those 11 children. It was how many more. And as the next investigation opened, the truth kept crawling from the shadows, child by child, memory by memory. Autumn came early that year in Georgia, the air sharper than usual, as if the wind itself had turned against silence. In a dense grove behind the former grounds of Haven Trust, now abandoned and overgrown, federal forensics teams were conducting a final sweep. The area had once been dismissed as irrelevant, never fully examined due to budgetary constraints. But Zion had insisted there were places they told us never to go, that's where the truth hides. For days, ground-penetrating radar found nothing. Then on the seventh day, in the northwest corner of the property near a collapsed greenhouse, the signals spiked. They uncovered bones, small, brittle, unmistakably human. At first, one set, then another, then fragments mixed with rusted wire, glass beads, and the torn edge of a child's shoe bearing faint initials. A.B. The news broke within hours. Remains believed to be children, found behind Haven Trust facility. Investigators confirmed at least 5 distinct skeletons, estimated to be children between 6 and 10 years old. DNA testing began immediately, with families of the 11 notified to provide samples. But in truth, they all knew. There was no other explanation. The children hadn't vanished. They had been buried, forgotten, hidden under flowers that no one dared to plant. Robert Gaines flew in to oversee the recovery. As he stood over the fresh excavation site, he held in his hand a laminated photo, the last picture taken of Aliyah Brooks before she entered the orphanage. Her smile was radiant, hopeful. She was wearing the bracelet she had given Zion, and now all they had left of her was a set of beads in the dirt. "This was never about closure," he whispered to the press. "This was about truth. Aliyah deserved better. They all did." In Washington, a congressional hearing was launched. Survivors were called to testify. Zion stood again, this time not alone, surrounded by 6 others who had come forward. Their voices were different, their experiences varied, but one thing united them. They had all lived under false names, afraid to remember, afraid to be found. One survivor, now a middle-aged woman named Althea, described being sent to a private school in the Midwest. "They told me I was lucky," she said. "But I was studied like a lab rat. They made me forget who I was. They gave me pills and new parents and told me my name was Deborah." She paused. "I didn't remember Aliyah's name until I saw the drawing. Then it all came back." The hearings revealed even darker truths. Government contracts masked under youth rehabilitation, forged death certificates, millions of dollars funneled through shell charities. It was not just negligence, it was design, and it targeted black children from poor, forgotten towns, the invisible, the voiceless, the ones no one came looking for. President Klein addressed the nation. "We failed a generation. These children were not lost, they were taken by a system that saw them as disposable, and today we begin to right that wrong." A federal task force named Project Ember was created to trace every child listed in Haven's records. Over 400 names were found. By year's end, 67 were located alive. Others were presumed dead or still missing. Mass memorials were held in Savannah, Atlanta, and Chicago. The mural of the 11 children was updated, each child now painted with a glowing ember at their heart. An eternal flame burned beneath the words, "You tried to bury us." But we were seeds. Back in Natchez, Zion returned to the cabin he once called home. He no longer needed to hide, but he wasn't ready to be seen either. He spent his days carving wood, each figure shaped from memory. Aliyah's laugh, Robert's courage, Sister Ruth's prayers. He sent them to families of the found, tokens of a shared story no longer shrouded in shame. And then, one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, no signature, only a pressed violet and a note in faint, careful handwriting.
"I remember you. You called me Little Bird. I didn't die. I flew."
Zion's hands trembled. Could it be her, after all this time? He held the flower close and smiled. Maybe not all the lost were gone. Maybe some had found their wings and soared. He stepped outside, the wind rustling the pines, and whispered, "She's still out there." Somewhere, far from the graves and courts and lights, hope stirred. And the story wasn't over yet. The sun was beginning to rise over the Mississippi River as Zion walked along the gravel path behind his cabin, the letter still folded in his pocket. It had been weeks since he received it, but the words echoed like thunder inside him. "I didn't die, I flew." He hadn't told Robert, he hadn't told anyone. Something inside him warned this was meant for him alone. He opened the drawer where he kept his most sacred things, a strand of Aaliyah's beaded bracelet, the corner of a drawing, a clipping of her obituary that was never published, just prepared and stored in case. He unfolded the letter again. This time he looked closer at the paper. At the bottom edge, nearly invisible, were embossed initials, HDM. Zion's heart stilled. That was the old name of the Haven Detention Medical Annex, a secondary building that was supposedly shut down before he even arrived. The letter had come from someone who had been there. By the time he arrived in Louisiana, the remains from the original Haven property had all been moved to a protected forensic archive. But the annex, buried under vines and half-collapsed, was still untouched. It had been dismissed as an old laundry facility. But Zion knew. He remembered that building. He remembered being dragged past it one night after wetting the bed and seeing a girl standing in the second-story window holding a paper bird. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and silence. Flashlight in hand, he moved slowly through the halls, dust rising around his boots. In the far corner, a broken staircase led upward to a sealed room. He forced it open, and then he saw it. Drawings, hundreds of them. Lined along the walls, fading in time but unmistakable, crayon renderings of trees, birds, rivers, and one drawing, a boy with a crooked smile and a girl with curly hair holding hands in front of a giant oak. It was titled Me and Zion, 1967. Tears blurred his eyes. She had been here. She had survived longer than he thought. On the far wall, etched in childlike handwriting, were words he would never forget. "If I go, let it be flying, not in fear, not in silence." He dropped to his knees. In that moment, he wasn't a survivor or a whistleblower. He was just a boy again, mourning the friend who had taught him how to laugh in a place built to make them forget how. Back in D.C., the results of the bone testing had returned. 5 identities confirmed, 2 still in progress. But one set of remains, found furthest from the others, by the edge of the collapsed greenhouse, was missing any match at all. No dental records, no DNA link to known families. Yet next to those remains was found a broken string of beads and one final crayon-drawn note, sealed inside a rusted tin. "If this is found, my name is Aaliyah Brooks. I was born free." The room went silent when the report was read. Zion, sitting in the back, stood up and walked out. He knew the truth now. She never stopped fighting. She had written herself back into history even when the world tried to erase her. 3 months later, in the center of Savannah, a permanent monument was unveiled. Not just a mural, a sanctuary. The Aaliyah Brooks Center for Justice and Memory opened to the public. Inside were testimonies from survivors, archived evidence, digital reconstructions of the lost children's artwork, and a garden shaped in the outline of 11 stars. One for each child, 11 names engraved in stone. But beneath them, a 12th plaque read, "And to the unknown child, and may your story always be told." That night, Zion stood beneath the stars, surrounded by families who had once thought no one would care about their missing children. The choir sang softly, and as candles were lit one by one, he whispered her name, not in grief, but in triumph. Some wounds never close, some questions are never fully answered. But some stories, once unearthed, refuse to be buried again. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, every single name was finally spoken aloud.